The beginning of a fight for justice. The courtroom buzzed with muted whispers, the kind that carried both judgment and curiosity. At its center stood Jonathan Carter, a man with determination etched into every line on his face. Across the aisle, Karen, his ex-wife, sat composed, her lawyer whispering in her ear. Between them sat the heart of it all minus 12-year-old Julia Carter, a girl too young to bear the weight of what the day would determine. Jonathan took a deep breath, his heart hammering. He'd spent months fighting for this moment, a chance to reclaim custody of Julia after Karen had stripped away his parental rights years ago. Despite everything, Jonathan held on to hope that today the truth would shine through. "Mr. Carter," the judge called, her voice even and authoritative. "You may present your closing statement." Jonathan stood, buttoning his jacket to steady his trembling hands. His eyes briefly met Julia's, soft, understanding eyes that seemed to whisper, "You can do this, Dad." Clearing his throat, he began. "Your Honor, these past years have been the hardest of my life, not because of any personal failure, but because I've been separated from my daughter. I know this case isn't about me. It's about Julia, her safety, her well-being, her future. And that's why I'm here today, despite every obstacle thrown my way." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "I loved Julia from the moment she was born. But after my divorce, Karen used every tactic to paint me as an unfit father. She took my rights, moved Julia across the state, and made sure I couldn't reach her, not even on her birthdays. I worked long hours, yes, but only to provide a better life for my family. That effort was twisted into neglect. And now, I fear for Julia's well-being because Karen's neglect has cost her more than I ever imagined." Karen's lawyer jumped to object, but the judge waved him off, signaling Jonathan to continue. Jonathan adjusted his tie, his voice growing stronger. "Your Honor, Julia was diagnosed with leukemia 2 years ago, a diagnosis I didn't even know about until much later. Her treatments were inconsistent because Karen refused to prioritize them. I've since discovered she's missed appointments, and Julia herself has shared stories of her health being ignored." His voice cracked. "What kind of parent does that?" Gasps rippled through the room. Karen's calm exterior wavered as her lawyer leaned in to confer, but Jonathan pressed on, locking eyes with the judge. "I don't just want to be part of Julia's life again. I need to be. And more importantly, Julia needs me. She deserves stability, care, and someone who puts her health above personal convenience." The judge's expression remained neutral as she gestured for Jonathan to sit. He exhaled sharply, his emotions barely in check. The weight of everything rested now on Julia's testimony, the part that both terrified and inspired Jonathan. When Julia was called to the stand, the courtroom stilled. Her small frame seemed fragile, but her face was a mix of nerves and resolve. The bailiff helped her up, and after being sworn in, she turned to face the courtroom. "Julia," the judge began, her tone softer, "I understand this is hard for you. Take your time and feel free to speak openly. Can you tell us about your experience living with your mother?" Julia glanced at Karen, who stared back with a forced smile. Then she turned to Jonathan, her father's unwavering presence giving her strength. I love my mom," she started, her voice shaking. "But it's hard living with her. She's always angry. Sometimes she drinks, and when I get sick, she doesn't do much to help. There were times when I didn't have my medicine for weeks." The room collectively inhaled as Karen shot up. "That's a lie. She's lying," she shrieked, but her lawyer quickly pulled her back down, whispering furiously. The judge banged her gavel. "Ms. Carter, one more outburst, and you will be removed." Julia continued, her voice stronger now. "One time, I asked her why I couldn't go to my treatments, and she said, 'I can't keep missing work for this.' I thought maybe she was right, but then I found out she didn't even go to work. She stayed home with her friends." Jonathan gripped the edge of the table, trying to keep his anger in check. The judge leaned forward. "Julia, what do you want to happen today?" Do you want to live with your father? Julia nodded firmly, tears glistening in her eyes. Yes, my dad's always been there when I needed him, even when we weren't allowed to talk much. I know he'll take care of me. Karen's lawyer attempted to discredit Julia's testimony, bringing up past accusations against Jonathan, but Julia's words had already struck a chord with everyone in the room. After hours of deliberation, the judge returned with her verdict. Everyone leaned forward in their seats as she spoke. This court finds that it is in Julia Carter's best interest to grant full custody to her father, Jonathan Carter, effective immediately. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Karen screamed her protests, but she was quickly escorted out by security. Meanwhile, Jonathan sank into his seat, overwhelmed by relief and joy. Julia ran to him, and he caught her in his arms, holding her tightly. "You're safe now," he whispered. "I've got you." For Jonathan, this wasn't just a victory in court. It was a second chance to be the father Julia needed, and to repair the damage Karen had done. But as they left the courtroom, Jonathan knew this was only the beginning. He had won custody, but he would soon learn that Karen's neglect had caused irreparable harm to Julia's health. And the hardest fight of their lives was still ahead, uncovering the hidden toll. The sunlight streamed through the hospital's tall windows, warming the sterile white walls with a false sense of comfort. Jonathan Carter sat slumped in a plastic chair outside the pediatric oncology ward, his hands gripping the arms of his seat as though it were the only thing anchoring him. Inside one of the rooms, his daughter Julia was being prepared for a battery of tests. It had been less than 48 hours since the judge granted him full custody, and already, Jonathan was grappling with the enormity of what that meant. He had fought with every ounce of his strength to bring Julia home, but now he was realizing that Karen's neglect had left scars far deeper than he had imagined. The door to Julia's room opened, and Dr. Patel, the lead oncologist, stepped out, clipboard in hand. The doctor's calm demeanor did little to settle Jonathan's nerves. "Mr. Carter," Dr. Patel began, motioning for Jonathan to join him in the hallway. "We've completed Julia's preliminary assessments. There's a lot we need to discuss." Jonathan nodded and followed, his heart pounding in his chest. They entered a small consultation room filled with charts and medical diagrams. Dr. Patel gestured for him to sit, and Jonathan complied, his hands clenching into fists on his lap. "How is she?" Jonathan asked, his voice trembling. "She seemed okay. Better than I expected." Dr. Patel's expression softened. "Julia is resilient. That much is clear. But there are serious concerns regarding her condition. I've reviewed her medical history, and there are significant gaps in her treatment, specifically her post-remission care. Those gaps have allowed her leukemia to progress." Jonathan's heart sank. "Progress? What does that mean? How bad is it?" Dr. Patel leaned forward, his tone measured but grave. "The leukemia has relapsed. We're also seeing signs that it may have spread to her central nervous system. We need to conduct further tests, but I'll be honest with you, Mr. Carter. The lack of consistent care has put Julia in a very fragile state." Jonathan felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He pressed his palms against the table, his mind racing. How did this happen? Karen told the court Julia was in remission. She made it sound like everything was fine. Dr. Patel sighed. "I've seen this happen before. Families sometimes misunderstand what remission means. It doesn't mean the disease is gone. It means it's under control. But it requires vigilance, regular treatments, follow-ups, and maintenance therapy. Unfortunately, that didn't happen in Julia's case." Jonathan closed his eyes, his jaw tightening as he tried to suppress the anger bubbling inside him. "What do we do now? What can I do to fix this?" Dr. Patel hesitated, carefully choosing his words. "There are options, but they are aggressive and costly. Given Julia's condition, we recommend starting her on CAR T-cell therapy. It's an innovative treatment that could give her a fighting chance." Jonathan leaned forward. "Innovative? Does that mean experimental? Is it safe?" Dr. Patel nodded. It's approved and has shown promise in cases like Julia's. Essentially, we'll reprogram her immune cells to target the cancer cells more effectively. However, there's no guarantee. It's a cutting-edge treatment, and like all treatments, it comes with risks. Jonathan nodded slowly, absorbing the information. What about costs? I don't care how much it takes. I'll sell my house if I have to. Dr. Patel's lips pressed into a thin line. The therapy alone costs upwards of $400,000, and that doesn't include the bone marrow transplant she'll likely need afterward. Jonathan swallowed hard. Bone marrow transplant. Can I be her donor? We'll test you first, Dr. Patel replied. But it's unlikely you'll be a match. Julia's best chance is finding a donor through the registry. Jonathan felt a lump in his throat. He had spent years building a life of financial security, but now it all seemed inadequate in the face of this crisis. How soon do we need to start? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. As soon as possible, Dr. Patel said. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to manage her condition. The weight of the doctor's words pressed heavily on Jonathan as he left the consultation room. He needed air. He needed a moment to process everything. Walking down the corridor, he paused by Julia's room and peered through the small glass window. Inside, Julia sat upright in bed, her wig slightly askew, a tired smile on her face as a nurse chatted with her. She looked so small, so fragile, and yet there was a quiet strength about her that took Jonathan's breath away. She noticed him watching and waved, her smile widening. Jonathan managed a small wave back before stepping away. He couldn't let her see the turmoil on his face. Back in the parking lot, Jonathan paced beside his car, pulling out his phone to call his assistant, Morris. Morris, it's me, he said, his voice firm despite the quaver threatening to break through. I need you to do something for me. Of course, Mr. Carter, Morris replied without hesitation. What do you need? Draft a company-wide memo and social media post, Jonathan said. Explain that we're looking for bone marrow donors for my daughter. Make it personal. Her name, her story. I want everyone in our network to share it. We need to find a match. Understood, Morris said. I'll get on it right away. And Mr. Carter, if there's anything else you need, just let me know. Jonathan ended the call and leaned against the car, his mind racing. He wasn't just fighting for Julia's health. He was fighting against time, against the damage Karen had caused, and against his own guilt for not stepping in sooner. Later that evening, Jonathan returned to Julia's room. She was asleep, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He sat beside her, taking her small hand in his. For a long moment, he simply watched her, a mixture of love and anguish washing over him. Dad? Julia's voice was soft, her eyes fluttering open. Hey, sweetheart, Jonathan said, forcing a smile. I didn't mean to wake you. It's okay, she said, her voice groggy. Were you sitting here the whole time? Jonathan shook his head. No, I just got back. I had some things to take care of. Julia studied him, her young eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond her years. You're worried, aren't you? Jonathan hesitated before nodding. I am, Jules, but I'm also hopeful. We've got a plan, and we're going to do everything we can to get you better. Julia smiled faintly. Thanks, Dad. I'm glad you're here. Jonathan leaned forward, kissing her forehead. I'll always be here, Julia. I promise. As Julia drifted back to sleep, Jonathan sat back in the chair, his resolve hardening. This was his fight now, his chance to make up for the years he had lost. No matter the cost, no matter the sacrifices, he would give Julia the life she deserved. The unexpected ally. The hospital lights flickered faintly as Jonathan Carter paced the hallway outside Julia's room. It was well past midnight, but his mind refused to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Julia's pale face and heard the doctor's words echoing in his head. The leukemia has relapsed. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him from his thoughts. It was Morris, his assistant. Mr. Carter, the memo has been sent out, and the social media post is live. We're already seeing responses, people offering to be tested. It's early, but I think we'll get a good pool of potential donors. Jonathan exhaled, a small wave of relief washing over him. Thank you, Morris. That's exactly what we need. Keep me updated on any promising leads. After ending the call, Jonathan leaned against the cold wall, his mind racing with the next steps. The hospital bills were piling up, and the experimental therapy was a financial mountain he hadn't yet figured out how to climb. Despite his company's struggles, he was determined to make it work. Selling his assets, downsizing, taking out loans, whatever it took. The sound of heels clicking against the tile floor broke his reverie. He turned to see Lisa Blake, his ex-wife Karen's younger sister, walking briskly toward him. She held a bag in one hand and a determined expression on her face. "Lisa," Jonathan said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" Lisa stopped in front of him, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. "I saw the memo you sent out. I figured I'd come down and get tested to see if I'm a match for Julia." Jonathan blinked, momentarily stunned. You'd do that?" Lisa nodded firmly. "Of course. Julia's my niece. I should have stepped in sooner, Jonathan, but Karen, she made it impossible. She pushed me away, just like she did to you." Jonathan's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you, Lisa. I can't tell you how much this means to me. To Julia." Lisa placed a hand on his arm. "You don't have to thank me. I should have been here for both of you long before now." They walked together to the nurse's station, where Lisa filled out the necessary forms and submitted a blood sample for testing. As they waited, Lisa turned to Jonathan, her expression grim. "I went to see Karen this morning," she said quietly. "I thought maybe she'd finally wake up and take some responsibility. But when I got to the house, she wasn't there. The place was a mess. Bottles everywhere. The door wide open. She's gone, Jonathan." Jonathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He wasn't surprised, but it still stung. Karen had always had a way of disappearing when things got tough. "Did she leave any sign of where she went?" Lisa shook her head. "Nothing. I called a few people who used to know her, but no one's seen her in weeks. I hate to say it, but I don't think we can count on her to help." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "I wasn't counting on her. Julia needs people she can rely on, people who won't let her down. That's not Karen." Lisa placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're doing everything you can, Jonathan. Julia's lucky to have you." By the time the sun rose the next morning, Jonathan was back in Julia's room. She was awake, sitting up in bed with her sketchpad balanced on her knees. She'd always loved to draw, and he was relieved to see her doing something that brought her joy. "Morning, sweetheart," Jonathan said, sitting beside her. "What are you working on?" Julia held up her sketchpad, revealing a half-finished drawing of a family of foxes nestled under a tree. "It's us," she said with a shy smile. "You and me." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. "It's beautiful, Jules. You're so talented." Julia shrugged, but her smile grew. "It helps me feel better. When I draw, it's like the bad stuff fades away for a little while." Jonathan reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Whatever helps, sweetheart. I'll make sure you always have plenty of sketch pads and pencils." They spent the morning talking and laughing, the heaviness of the situation momentarily forgotten. But by midday, the nurse returned with news that brought them back to reality. "Mr. Carter, Ms. Blake's test results came back," the nurse said. "She's not a match for Julia." Jonathan's heart sank. Lisa had been their best hope for a quick match. Now, they were back to square one. Julia looked up at her father, her expression a mix of disappointment and determination. "What do we do now, Dad?" Jonathan squeezed her hand. "We keep looking, sweetheart. We don't give up." Later that day, Jonathan received an unexpected call. The number was unfamiliar, but something told him to answer. "Hello," he said, his tone wary. "Mr. Carter," a woman's voice replied. This is Dr. Elena Vasquez. I'm a research scientist with the National Bone Marrow Registry. I came across your story through social media. I believe we can help." Jonathan straightened in his chair. "Dr. Vasquez, thank you for calling. What do you mean by help?" "I've reviewed Julia's case, and I believe we can expedite the search for a donor. We have access to advanced genetic matching technology that could increase our chances of finding a match quickly. However, there's a catch." Jonathan's stomach clenched. What kind of catch? "This process is expensive and time-consuming," Dr. Vasquez explained. "It requires specialized resources, and while we're willing to assist, it would come at a cost." Jonathan's mind raced. He'd already begun liquidating his assets to pay for Julia's treatment. Could he afford this additional expense? Did it even matter if it meant saving Julia's life? "How much are we talking about?" he asked, bracing himself for the answer. Dr. Vasquez hesitated. $50,000 up front, with the possibility of additional costs depending on the complexity of the search. Jonathan exhaled slowly. It was a steep price, but not insurmountable. "I'll make it happen," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Dr. Vasquez's voice softened. "I understand this is a difficult time, Mr. Carter. We'll do everything we can to find a match for Julia. I'll send you the necessary paperwork to get started." After ending the call, Jonathan sat back, his mind spinning. He had a plan now, a way forward. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was hope, and that was enough to keep him moving. By evening, Jonathan found himself in Julia's room once again. She was asleep, her sketchpad resting on her chest. He picked it up gently, flipping through the pages. Each drawing told a story of hope, of family, of dreams she hadn't yet given up on. He looked down at his daughter, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and determination. "I'll find a way, Jules," he whispered, "no matter what it takes." As he sat there, watching over her, Jonathan realized something. The fight wasn't just about saving Julia's life. It was about giving her the chance to live the life she deserved. A life filled with love, laughter, and the knowledge that she was never alone. And Jonathan was prepared to do whatever it took to make that happen. A race against time. The evening sky outside the hospital window burned with shades of crimson and gold, casting long shadows into Julia's room. Jonathan Carter sat at her bedside, watching his daughter sleep. Despite her pale complexion and frail body, there was a quiet strength in her that left him in awe. He'd seen that same strength in the courtroom when Julia had spoken the truth about her mother. But now, the stakes were even higher. This was a battle for her life. Jonathan's phone buzzed on the small table next to him. It was a text from Morris. "Sir, I've received multiple inquiries about potential donors from employees and social media. Some are willing to undergo testing. Let me know if you'd like to move forward." Jonathan's fingers flew over the screen as he replied. "Yes, move forward with all willing candidates. Coordinate with Dr. Vasquez to expedite the process. Thank you, Morris." He set the phone down, exhaling slowly. The weight of the situation was a constant pressure on his chest, but he couldn't afford to falter. Julia needed him to be strong. The next morning, Jonathan met with Dr. Vasquez in her research lab, located an hour away from the hospital. The facility was sleek and modern, its glass walls and advanced equipment a testament to cutting-edge science. As they walked through the lab, Dr. Vasquez explained the process. "Our goal is to identify a genetic match for Julia as quickly as possible," she said, gesturing to a monitor displaying rows of DNA sequences. "We've already begun analyzing the samples sent from your network. With our advanced technology, we can narrow down the search significantly." Jonathan nodded, absorbing the information. "And if we don't find a match here?" Dr. Vasquez hesitated, her expression somber. "If we don't find a match within your immediate network, we'll expand the search globally. However, that could take weeks or even months. Time Julia may not have." Jonathan's stomach churned at the thought, but he forced himself to focus. "Let's start with what we have. Keep me updated on every step." Dr. Vasquez offered a reassuring smile. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Carter." Julia's story has already inspired many. You'd be surprised how quickly people are willing to step up. Back at the hospital, Jonathan found Julia sitting upright in bed, her sketchpad in hand. She looked up as he entered, her face lighting up with a smile. "Dad, Aunt Lisa brought me some new pencils," she said, holding up a small case of brightly colored pencils. Lisa, who was seated in a chair by the window, gave Jonathan a small wave. "I figured she could use something cheerful," Lisa said. "Drawing seems to be her happy place." Jonathan smiled, grateful for Lisa's presence. "It's perfect. Thank you." As Lisa stepped out to grab coffee, Jonathan sat beside Julia, watching as she meticulously shaded a sunset over a meadow. Her focus was intense, her brow furrowed in concentration. "That's beautiful, Jules," he said softly. "You've got real talent." Julia glanced at him, her cheeks flushing. "Thanks, Dad. I want to get better so I can draw outside again. Remember how we used to go to the park?" Jonathan nodded, his throat tightening. "I remember. And we'll do that again soon, I promise." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Blood samples were collected, donors were tested, and Jonathan found himself juggling meetings with doctors, calls from Morris, and moments with Julia. Each passing hour felt like a countdown, the urgency gnawing at him. One evening, as Jonathan sat in the hospital's cafeteria with Lisa, his phone buzzed. It was Dr. Vasquez. "Mr. Carter, we've identified a potential match," she said, her voice filled with cautious optimism. Jonathan's heart leaped. "Who is it?" "Someone from my company." "No," Dr. Vasquez replied. "The match is actually someone from the National Bone Marrow Registry. A woman named Elena Rodriguez. She's a 24-year-old teacher from Arizona. She's agreed to the procedure." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, relief flooding through him. "Thank God. What happens now?" "We'll bring her in for further testing to confirm compatibility," Dr. Vasquez explained. "If everything checks out, we can proceed with the transplant." Jonathan nodded, his mind racing. "How soon can we get her here?" "She's already on her way," Dr. Vasquez said. "But Mr. Carter, there's something you should know. Elena has her own health concerns. She's recovering from a minor surgery, and while she's willing to proceed, there are risks involved." Jonathan's relief was tempered by worry. "What kind of risks?" "Nothing life-threatening," Dr. Vasquez assured him. "But the process will be more physically demanding for her. She's remarkably brave for stepping forward." Jonathan felt a surge of gratitude for this stranger who was willing to endure so much for his daughter. "Please let her know how much this means to us," he said. "And if there's anything she needs, I'll cover it." The next morning, Jonathan sat with Julia, explaining the news in simple terms. "Sweetheart, we found a match," he said, taking her hand. "A very kind woman has agreed to be your donor." Julia's eyes widened. "Really? Is she nice? Can I meet her?" Jonathan smiled. "She seems very nice, and maybe one day you can meet her. But for now, she's doing this to help you, even though she doesn't know you. That's how amazing she is." Julia's expression softened, a mix of gratitude and wonder crossing her face. "I want to thank her. Can you tell her that, Dad?" Jonathan nodded, his heart swelling. "I will, sweetheart. I promise." As the days passed, the transplant preparations began. Julia underwent rigorous tests to ensure her body was ready for the procedure. Jonathan stayed by her side through every step, offering words of encouragement and holding her hand when she felt scared. Elena Rodriguez arrived at the hospital, and though she and Julia couldn't meet due to medical protocol, Jonathan took a moment to thank her personally. "Ms. Rodriguez," he said, shaking her hand, "I don't have the words to express how grateful I am. What you're doing, it's beyond selfless." Elena smiled, her dark eyes warm. "I'm just glad I can help. Julia seems like an incredible kid." "She is," Jonathan said, his voice thick with emotion. And because of you, she has a chance. Elena placed a reassuring hand on his arm. Let's hope for the best. The night before the transplant, Jonathan sat in Julia's room, watching her sleep. The hum of the monitors and the soft glow of the bedside lamp created a fragile cocoon around them. I won't let you down, Jules, he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. We're almost there. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to hope, not just for Julia's survival, but for the life they would rebuild together. The trial of hope. The morning of Julia's bone marrow transplant arrived with a mixture of quiet anticipation and heavy tension. The hospital buzzed with activity, but inside Julia's room, time seemed to move slowly. The sterile air carried the faint scent of antiseptic, and the rhythmic beeping of monitors filled the otherwise silent space. Jonathan Carter sat by Julia's bedside, holding her small hand in his. She was awake, but unusually quiet, her big eyes watching him intently. The hospital gown seemed too large for her frail frame, and her wig sat neatly on the nightstand beside her bed. "Dad," Julia said softly, her voice breaking the stillness. Jonathan turned to her, forcing a smile. "Yes, sweetheart. Are you scared?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Because I am. A little." Jonathan's heart ached. He leaned closer, brushing a strand of her hair from her face. "It's okay to be scared, Jules. I am too, but you know what? Being scared just means you're brave enough to face something hard. And you're the bravest person I know." Julia offered a small smile, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "What if it doesn't work? What if?" She paused, her words catching in her throat. "What if I don't get better?" Jonathan's chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Then we'll keep fighting. One step at a time. But I believe in you, Julia. You're stronger than you think, and you have so many people rooting for you. Me, Aunt Lisa, your doctors, even Elena. You're not alone in this." Julia nodded, squeezing his hand tightly. "Thank you, Dad, for everything." Jonathan kissed her forehead, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you, Jules, more than anything." By mid-morning, the medical team arrived to prepare Julia for the procedure. Jonathan stood back, his arms crossed tightly as he watched the nurses work with calm efficiency. They explained the steps to Julia in soft tones, their voices reassuring. Despite their professionalism, Jonathan couldn't shake the knot of anxiety in his stomach. As Julia was wheeled out of the room toward the operating suite, Jonathan followed, stopping just outside the double doors where a nurse gently halted him. "This is as far as you can go, Mr. Carter," she said kindly. "We'll take good care of her." Jonathan nodded, his voice catching as he whispered, "Take care of my girl." Hours passed in agonizing slowness. Jonathan paced the waiting room, his mind racing with every possible outcome. Lisa joined him, her presence a steadying force. She handed him a cup of coffee, though he barely touched it. "She's going to be okay," Lisa said, her voice firm. "Julia's a fighter, Jonathan, just like her dad." Jonathan managed a weak smile. "I hope you're right. I can't lose her, Lisa." "You won't," Lisa said, gripping his arm. "We've come too far to give up now." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Vasquez emerged from the operating suite, her face a mixture of exhaustion and cautious optimism. Jonathan and Lisa stood immediately, their eyes locked on her. "How is she?" Jonathan asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Vasquez offered a small smile. "The transplant went as planned. Julia is stable, but the next few weeks are critical. Her immune system is essentially wiped out, so she'll be highly vulnerable to infections. We'll monitor her closely to ensure her body accepts the new bone marrow." Jonathan felt a wave of relief wash over him, though the doctor's words tempered his hope. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for everything." "You're welcome," Dr. Vasquez said. "She's in recovery now. You can see her shortly." When Jonathan entered Julia's recovery room, his heart clenched. She looked even smaller than before, her face pale and her breathing shallow. Monitors beeped steadily, and an IV line delivered fluids and medications to her fragile body. He pulled a chair up to her bedside, taking her hand in his. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You did it. You're so strong." Julia's eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile crossed her lips. "Hi, Dad," she murmured, her voice weak but filled with warmth. "Did it work?" Jonathan swallowed hard, fighting back tears. "The doctors say it went perfectly. Now we just have to wait and see. But I know you've got this, Jules." Julia's eyelids grew heavy, and she drifted back to sleep. Jonathan sat with her for hours, watching over her as she rested. Every beep of the monitors felt like a lifeline, a fragile tether keeping her with him. Over the next week, Julia's condition remained stable, though the journey was far from over. She faced bouts of nausea, fevers, and exhaustion, but she never complained. Jonathan was by her side through every moment, offering words of encouragement and quiet reassurances. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Julia turned to Jonathan with a determined look in her eyes. "Dad," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days, "when I get better, can we do something fun? Like, go to the park or the zoo?" Jonathan smiled, his heart swelling with hope. "Anything you want, Jules. We'll do it all." Julia's eyes sparkled. "Promise. Promise," Jonathan said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "We'll make up for all the time we lost." As the days turned into weeks, Julia's strength began to return, little by little. Her doctors were cautiously optimistic, and Jonathan clung to every glimmer of hope. He knew the road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that they were moving toward a brighter future. One evening, as Julia sketched in her notebook, Jonathan watched her quietly, a sense of gratitude washing over him. They had faced so much together, and yet here she was, resilient, creative, and full of life. "You're incredible, Jules," he said softly. "Do you know that?" Julia looked up, her smile radiant. "I had a pretty good teacher." Jonathan felt tears sting his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. Instead, he reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "We're going to be okay," he said. "I promise." And for the first time, Jonathan believed it. A future reclaimed. Weeks turned into months, and the sterile walls of the hospital that had once felt suffocating began to fade into the background of Julia Carter's recovery. Each passing day brought new challenges, but also new victories. Julia's body was showing signs of accepting the transplant, her strength gradually returning. Jonathan Carter's life had shifted entirely. His days revolved around Julia, tracking her medication schedules, consulting with doctors, and ensuring she had everything she needed. The fight wasn't over, but there was hope now, a tangible light at the end of the tunnel. A step toward freedom. It was a crisp morning when Dr. Vasquez entered Julia's room with a smile that hinted at good news. "Mr. Carter, Julia," she began, flipping through a chart. "The latest tests show that the transplanted bone marrow is producing healthy blood cells. This is a very encouraging sign." Jonathan's heart swelled with relief. "So, what does this mean? Is she out of the woods?" Dr. Vasquez held up a hand. "Not entirely. We're still in a critical period. Her immune system is rebuilding, and she'll need to remain on medication for a while to prevent complications. But if all goes well, we can start discussing outpatient care." Julia's eyes lit up. "Does that mean I get to go home?" she asked, her voice brimming with excitement. Dr. Vasquez smiled warmly. "Not quite yet, but soon. If you keep improving like this, I don't see why we couldn't discharge you in the next few weeks." Jonathan looked at his daughter, who was practically glowing with joy. For the first time in what felt like forever, her future didn't seem overshadowed by fear. A message of gratitude. One afternoon, Julia sat cross-legged in her hospital bed, her sketchpad balanced on her knees. She was working on a project she'd been planning for weeks. A thank you card for Elena Rodriguez, the donor who had saved her life. "Dad," Julia said, holding up the card, which featured a beautifully drawn tree with strong, vibrant branches. "Do you think she'll like it?" Jonathan smiled, his chest tightening with pride. "She'll love it, sweetheart. It's beautiful." The card read, "Dear Ms. Rodriguez, thank you for saving my life. I don't know how to thank you enough for what you've done. My dad says you're really brave, and I think so too. When I get better, I want to grow up and help people, just like you helped me. Love, Julia." Jonathan's voice was thick as he spoke. "You're amazing, Jules. I'll make sure this gets to her." The day of discharge. The day Julia was finally discharged from the hospital was filled with a mixture of celebration and cautious optimism. Jonathan had spent the past week preparing their home, cleaning, restocking the kitchen, and turning Julia's room into a cozy haven complete with fresh bedding and her favorite stuffed animals. As they wheeled her out of the hospital, Julia's face lit up as she felt the sun on her skin for the first time in months. "Fresh air," she said, closing her eyes and breathing deeply. "I missed this." Jonathan chuckled, fighting back tears. "We're just getting started, sweetheart. Wait until you see what's next. Rebuilding a life." At home, Jonathan dedicated himself to giving Julia the life she had missed out on. He took a leave of absence from his company, delegating responsibilities to Morris, who had proven to be an invaluable ally. The company wasn't out of financial trouble, but Jonathan refused to let that overshadow his priorities. Julia thrived in her new environment. She resumed her schooling online, her natural curiosity and love for learning shining through. She began to laugh more, her sketches growing more colorful and intricate. Her hair started to grow back, and with it came a confidence that had been missing for so long. Karen's shadow. Despite their progress, Karen remained a shadow in their lives. Jonathan had received occasional updates from Lisa about Karen's whereabouts, but she had made no effort to contact Julia. One day, Lisa came by to visit, bringing a box of old family photos and mementos she had found while cleaning out Karen's old house. "I thought Julia might want these," Lisa said, placing the box on the kitchen counter. Jonathan hesitated, glancing at the box. "Do you think Karen will ever come around? Really change?" Lisa sighed. "I don't know, Jonathan. But honestly, Julia doesn't need her if she's not willing to put in the work. She has us." Jonathan nodded, his resolve strengthening. "You're right. Julia deserves people who will show up for her." A promise fulfilled. One sunny afternoon, Jonathan and Julia sat together on a picnic blanket in the park. It was the first outing they'd had since her discharge, and Julia was soaking up every moment. "Dad, look at that tree," Julia said, pointing to a massive oak with sprawling branches. "It's so big and strong." Jonathan smiled. "Kind of like you, huh?" Julia grinned, leaning against him. "Thanks, Dad, for everything." Jonathan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "No, Jules. Thank you. You've taught me what really matters. I'm so proud of you." As they sat there, watching the world move around them, Jonathan felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long and filled with unimaginable challenges, but they had made it through together. And for the first time in years, the future felt like a gift, one they would cherish every single day. Epilogue. A new purpose. Years later, Julia stood in front of an audience at a charity gala, her voice steady and confident as she spoke. "My name is Julia Carter, and I'm a leukemia survivor," she began. "When I was 12, I was given a second chance at life, thanks to the generosity of a stranger and the unwavering support of my dad." Jonathan watched from the crowd, his heart swelling with pride. Julia had grown into a strong, compassionate young woman, dedicating her life to helping others through her art and advocacy. "Life isn't always easy," Julia continued, her eyes scanning the room. "But with love, hope, and resilience, we can overcome even the hardest challenges. And sometimes the most beautiful things come from the toughest battles. The room erupted into applause as Julia stepped down from the podium, her eyes meeting Jonathan's. He opened his arms, and she rushed into his embrace. "You did amazing, Jules," he whispered. "I'm so proud of you." "Thanks, Dad," she said, her voice full of warmth. "I couldn't have done it without you." As they stood there, surrounded by the people whose lives Julia had touched, Jonathan knew they had reclaimed not just Julia's health, but a future filled with boundless possibilities. Together, they had turned their pain into purpose, their struggles into strength, and that was the greatest victory of all. Closing the chapter. The applause from Julia's speech still echoed in Jonathan's ears as they stepped off the stage at the charity gala. The air was filled with energy, a collective sense of purpose and unity among the attendees who had gathered to support leukemia research and patient care. Julia's story had touched hearts, inspiring donations, and sparking conversations about hope and resilience. As they walked toward their table, Jonathan caught sight of a familiar figure standing near the entrance. His heart skipped a beat. It was Karen. She looked different, tired, older, but sober. Her once chaotic demeanor was now replaced with a tentative calm. She held a small envelope in her hands, her eyes locked on Julia. "Dad," Julia whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "It's Mom." Jonathan placed a hand on Julia's shoulder. "Stay here, sweetheart. Let me talk to her first." He approached Karen slowly, his expression guarded. "Karen, what are you doing here?" Karen's eyes welled with tears. I saw the announcement about the gala online. I wasn't sure if I should come, but after hearing Julia's speech, I had to. I needed to see her." Jonathan sighed, his emotions a swirl of frustration and pity. "You've been gone for years, Karen. Do you really think showing up now will change anything?" Karen nodded, her grip tightening on the envelope. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Jonathan. I messed up, badly. But I've been in recovery for the past year, and I'm trying to make things right. I wanted to give this to Julia." She handed him the envelope, her hands trembling. "It's a letter. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but if you think she's ready, maybe she could read it. If not, I'll understand." Jonathan studied her, searching for sincerity. For the first time in years, he saw a glimmer of the woman he had once loved, the woman who, despite her faults, had once shared in his dreams of a family. "I'll give it to her," he said finally. "But Karen, this is her decision, not mine. If she's not ready, you'll have to accept that." Karen nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you for being there for her when I couldn't." Back at their table, Jonathan handed the envelope to Julia. "It's from your mom," he said gently. "She wants you to read it, but only if you're ready." Julia stared at the envelope for a long moment, her fingers tracing its edges. Finally, she nodded and opened it. Jonathan watched as her eyes moved across the page, her expression shifting from confusion to sadness, and finally to a quiet resolve. When she finished reading, she folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. "She says she's sorry," Julia said softly. "That she knows she hurt me and she's trying to change. She wants to see me." Jonathan knelt beside her, his hands resting on hers. "What do you want to do, Jules? It's your choice." Julia's gaze shifted to the corner of the room where Karen stood, watching them from a distance. After a moment, she took a deep breath. "I'll talk to her, just for a few minutes." Jonathan nodded, his heart swelling with pride at Julia's courage. "I'll be right here if you need me." Julia approached Karen cautiously, her steps slow but steady, Karen's eyes filled with tears as her daughter stood before her. "Hi, Mom," Julia said, her voice soft but firm. Karen's lip quivered. "Hi, sweetheart. You were amazing up there. Your speech, it was beautiful." "Thanks," Julia replied, her tone guarded. "Why are you here?" Karen swallowed hard. "I wanted to tell you how sorry I am. For everything. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I'm trying to be better. I want to be part of your life again, if you'll let me." Julia studied her mother, her young face a mixture of pain and wisdom. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she said honestly. "But maybe we can start small, like letters or phone calls. I need time." Karen nodded, wiping her tears. "Of course. Anything you need. I'll wait as long as it takes, Julia." Julia hesitated, then offered a small smile. "Thank you." Karen reached out tentatively, and Julia allowed a brief hug before stepping back. As she returned to Jonathan, her steps were lighter, her expression clearer. "How do you feel?" Jonathan asked. "Better," Julia said. "I don't know what the future holds for Mom and me, but at least I said what I needed to." Jonathan pulled her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you, Jules. You're incredible." A new beginning. Months later, Julia's health continued to improve. She returned to school, started art classes, and even organized a fundraiser for leukemia research, inspired by her journey. Jonathan watched her blossom with a mixture of awe and gratitude, cherishing every moment they shared. Karen kept her word, maintaining contact through letters and phone calls. While the relationship was far from repaired, it was a step forward, a chance for healing. On a sunny afternoon, Julia and Jonathan sat on the porch of their home, sipping lemonade and flipping through a scrapbook they had made together. Each page was filled with memories of their journey, hospital wristbands, photos from their park outings, and Julia's artwork. "Dad," Julia said, her voice thoughtful, "do you think everything we went through happened for a reason?" Jonathan smiled, his eyes misty. "I think it showed us how strong we are, and how much we can overcome when we stick together." Julia leaned against him, her voice soft but resolute. "I want to spend my life helping people, Dad, just like everyone who helped me." Jonathan kissed the top of her head. "And you will, sweetheart. You've already changed the world more than you know." As they sat together, the weight of the past felt lighter, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. Their journey had been one of pain and perseverance, but it had also been one of love and triumph. Together, they had reclaimed their lives, and no challenge would ever break them again.